So what the hell is podcast SEO and why should you care in the first place? Now look, 2 years into my journey of becoming a podcast coach, I was on a mission to figure out all the latest and greatest strategies in order to help my clients grow their shows. I wanted to be number one in the podcast coaching space. I remember I would go into Facebook groups and I always felt like something was missing. And my clients are always growing consistently, but they never got like explosive growth for the most part. And I was in these Facebook groups and I would see these different people talk about how they had grown magically somehow to 10,000 monthly downloads. And to some degree, I was blown away, but I'm not going to lie to you. I was slightly triggered and slightly pissed off because whenever you'd ask them, hey, what the hell? How did you do this? How did you grow your podcast so fast? And it'll give you the exact same answer, which was, oh, just post valuable, good content consistently and share on social media and the show will grow. And I was like, dude, yeah, obviously, like I get that, right? But for some reason, something felt off to me because my clients had been podcasting and putting out good content for years, right? And they still weren't getting like these crazy levels of growth. It was slow and steady growth that we're consistently getting. Anyways, I eventually find this guy called Jake Ward who grew his podcast to 300,000 monthly downloads in literally, I believe it was like 9 to 11 months, which was insane. Like I was completely unheard of. And the craziest part about this was he wasn't posting on social media and he didn't have high profile guests on his show. He actually didn't have guests at all on his podcast. And I remember asking him, hey dude, like what the hell, how are you growing? And thankfully, he actually knew what was driving the growth for his show. And he mentioned this thing known as podcast SEO. And I'll be honest with you, in that moment, I was completely hooked. And thankfully, because Jake at that point actually had tons of experience with traditional SEO, which is what most people are aware of. Traditional SEO is just like Google SEO, ranking on Google websites, all that kind of stuff, blogs. So he had a bunch of experience and he transferred all of that knowledge to podcasting. I remember he had all these trainings, all of these resources, and I just soaked it all up. I was completely obsessed. And then slowly I started testing out these different methods, these SEO strategies on our client show, and it actually started working. I remember one client was stuck at 400 monthly downloads for 2 years, just posting consistently, sharing genuinely valuable content that was meaningful, but it just wasn't going anywhere. And she was on the verge of quitting, and it wasn't until we optimized her show for podcast SEO that her show blew up. She went from 400 monthly downloads to 23,000 monthly downloads 11 months later, which again was insane. And we had this other client in a similar spot. She was stuck below 600 monthly downloads. And then we optimized her show for podcast SEO, and her show grew to around 7,000 in like, I think 6 or 7 months, as in 7,000 monthly downloads. And that kept on happening repeatedly. And that was one of the first time I realized, like, holy crap, there are very specific strategies, because at that time we tried social media, but that was inconsistent and like, it didn't really help people grow. It helped people engage their current audience, but that wasn't a consistent way to reach new listeners. And of course, about like, targeting the right audience, building a good content strategy. We had all those pieces, but this felt like this missing piece, and the results we got were genuinely mind-blowing. So that's great, but what the hell actually is podcast SEO? Because there's so many misconceptions out there, so many myths about what podcast SEO is, what it isn't, and I want to clarify that. So podcast SEO is standing for search engine optimization, is the process of ranking your show and your podcast higher on Apple and Spotify. Now, cool, why should you care? Well, the reason you should care is because Apple and Spotify, that's the main platform the majority of new listeners are going to on a day-to-day basis to discover new shows. When you promote on social media, most people aren't going on social media to find a new podcast to listen to. The exact same way that you are absolutely not opening up your Facebook account, you're not opening up TikTok, you're not opening up Instagram or LinkedIn. You never go on these platforms with the intention of finding a new show to listen to. It doesn't happen. That's why oftentimes when you are promoting constantly on social media, it doesn't actually help you grow. Like, it's great to build awareness and exposure, but it doesn't help you increase your monthly downloads. And it's because the majority of people on those platforms, none of them, zero, no one is going to discover new shows and new podcasts on these platforms. Whereas with Apple and Spotify, people, listeners, the people who are probably downloading your podcast currently, those invisible listeners that just come out of nowhere, that seem like a number on a screen, where do they come from, right? They come from Apple and Spotify by individuals going onto these platforms and searching up certain keywords. And that's how they discover your show. Podcast SEO, again, is that process of having your show rank high on Apple and Spotify. This sounds great, sounds fantastic. The issue is that most people have like these wrong beliefs around what podcast SEO is. They think it's too complicated. They think it takes way too long. They think you have to be like an SEO expert, when in reality, it's just a very straightforward process and a reliable way of ranking your podcast higher in Apple and Spotify, becoming way more visible organically on the platforms new listeners go to discover new shows. Can you imagine what that would be like to actually be visible on these platforms? That when someone searches in how to reduce anxiety, if your podcast is about anxiety, they can find you. Now, to be honest, when you first get started with podcast SEO, it can feel complicated. It can feel very confusing. And it's because people kind of misinterpret podcast SEO with traditional SEO, which is to do with blogs and long show notes and all of these crazy meta tags and all this stuff, right? And websites. But that has nothing to do with podcast SEO. That's ranking on Google. That's not ranking your show on Apple and Spotify. And the reason we don't focus on, again, Google is because no one's searching in on Google podcasts to listen to. That's not how people discover shows. That'd be gross. Ugh, what the hell? Now, it's important to note that podcast SEO is a simple process if you have the right strategy and system in place. And in just a moment, I'm going to break that down for you. But I think it's important to note that the goal here really is to have your show become more visible on Apple and Spotify. Because if you've been posting content for years now and the show isn't growing and you have a business and you have an incredible message to share and you're wondering, why the hell am I working so hard, but it feels like I'm not really picking up traction? Shouldn't my show have at least grown a lot more by now, right? 9 times out of 10 with the clients that we work with, none of them are optimized for podcast SEO, which means they spend years creating the best content ever that no one can find, because when their audience searches in how to heal my migraine, if they've got a migraine podcast, when they're ranking for the keywords they're meant to, meaning the search terms that people type in, they're not being discovered, right? Or if it's like how to reduce anxiety, if you have an anxiety podcast and you're not on page 1 of Apple and Spotify because you're not optimized for podcast SEO, how the hell do you expect people to find you? And the people who are looking for these topics, migraines, how to grow a podcast, how to heal from anxiety, they're what we call high intent listeners, meaning they are going on these platforms, typing in these keywords actively with the intention of wanting to find a show to listen to. This is a very different person compared to someone who sees your advertisement or your short form clip on bloody Instagram Reels. That's a very different person, right? One of them is very distracted, probably on the toilet, doing you know what, who it will not listen to your podcast the same way, you might see a clip. That's a good clip. I love that clip. Am I going to listen to the next? Am I going to spend the next hour listening to their podcast? No, it was a good clip. That's it. Whereas in comparison to trying to convince someone who's actively looking for your show, it's so much easier to turn that person who's literally searching for your content. It's so much easier to convince them to press play and listen to your podcast. So if you want to grow, you need to be visible on Apple and Spotify. You have to be. And if you want to be visible on Apple and Spotify, you need to optimize your show to rank higher on Apple and Spotify. How do we do this? Well, we do this through data-driven podcast SEO. Sounds super fancy. I'm going to break it down for you right now. And really, there's really 4 key parts to this. The first one is what we call discoverability, meaning how do you get your show discovered? How you do this is by thinking about the main keywords and search terms your audience will type in to discover your show. Now, the trick here is don't think about the name of your podcast and think that's my search term, and then search in your name of your show thinking, oh, I'm on page 1 for my podcast name. Well, of course you are, because you're typing your actual name. But most people don't know your show name because they haven't found your show. So you have to think about the overarching category you're in, the niche and space you're in, and type that in. So for example, if your podcast is about anxiety, most people would search in how to reduce anxiety. That's how they find your show. If your podcast is about real estate, you might type in real estate investing. You wouldn't type in the name of your podcast. You just type in the general keywords, and a keyword is, again, what your audience would search in on Apple and Spotify to find a show like yours, similar to yours. So you type in, real estate investing, and you want to look at the results. If you're not ranking for the main keywords your audience are typing in and you're not on page 1, you're not visible. Like if you're on page 2, that's still a problem. I don't know about you, but when the hell was the last time you're on page 2 on any platform, whether that's Amazon, Google, or podcasts? You don't. You want to be on page 1. So again, step 1 is discoverability. Thinking about the main keywords your audience would search in on Apple and Spotify to discover a podcast like yours. That's the keyword you then want to add into your show name, your episode titles, in your show description, in your show notes. Adding these keywords in those areas, it gives Apple and Spotify the information that they need to index your show. Index meaning categorize your show, meaning we're going to show this podcast to more people who search in how to reduce anxiety. Again, that's indexing. They're like categorizing your show. So they know who to send, like what results to show to their users, right? That's step 1, discoverability, knowing which keywords to rank for in the first place. Step number 2 is visibility. Now, I would love to sit here and say, you know what, guys, all you have to do is add a bunch of keywords to your title, to your show notes, and the podcast will blow up. Trust me, I've tried. It doesn't work, unfortunately. It simply doesn't work. And this is the reason. Imagine for a second you walk into your local supermarket and you go to the strawberry aisle to find some strawberries. And let's say there was a bunch of different brands that were there, right? How would you know which one to pick from? Let's say your strawberry was part of that pack. How would you know which one to pick from? If there's just a bunch, how would you know which one's the best one to pick from? Now, just because someone's gone to your aisle and can discover your show, just because they can type in, how to reduce anxiety, and they scroll for like 20 pages and they might glimpse at your podcast, right? It doesn't mean they'll know that your podcast is the right podcast for them. It just means that they can find your podcast because you're categorized under the right categories. The same way you might go to, a supermarket, maybe you're like a bloody strawberry connoisseur. But if you have just a bunch of options, how will you know which one to pick from? You wouldn't. And that's exactly what we have to fix. Because when someone searches in, we use real estate, for example, real estate podcast, there's a bunch of options that show up. And you're now competing for that potential listener's attention. It's you versus everyone else who's come up on the results. So how do we get your show visible? How do we get your podcast to stand out so that they click your podcast over the competition and press play and listen? How do we do that, right? Because if you're just discovering they can find you, but they never actually click play, then you don't actually grow your show with the strategy. How do we get your podcast visible? Well, number 1, we have to think, what makes your show stand out? Like, what is that listener seeing? Well, they're looking at your cover art. So we have to optimize your cover art to be attractive, to be vibrant, to be bright. It needs to look different in comparison to other shows out there. If everyone else's cover art is black, maybe yours should be red. Maybe yours should be white. Maybe yours should be a different color, right? That's the first thing. The second thing is making sure your actual show name speaks to that individual and is way more specific. How about real estate investing for beginners? If you can call out your audience in your show name, that again helps you stand out. And then thirdly, making sure the episode title that you're using, right, because they're going to see episode titles, making sure that each episode, the titles are bangers, that they're irresistible. And you want to make sure that you're calling out the audience. You're making a title super specific so that person feels like that episode was made for them. But you also, more importantly, you want to add intrigue, right, to make them feel like they should click play and listen. All of these elements are playing a role in your show's visibility because it might be your show versus another show. And if that show has a much better title that's more captivating and a richer, more vibrant cover art that stands out, they're going to win 9 times out of 10. So your packaging of your show needs to be presented in a way that grabs this person's attention and shows them exactly why they should click play and listen. By the way, your show notes are also a main part in this, right? People do read show notes. I think it's weird personally. I don't read show notes, but people do read show notes. So again, making sure your show notes is speaking to that person's pain points, is presenting your podcast and showing all the value and the benefits they will gain from listening and showing them why they can't afford not to listen. That's a presentation piece. Again, that's making your show way more visible and increasing your click-through, the clickability, the likelihood someone clicks play on your show versus the competition. That is the second part of podcast SEO. We've got discoverability, rank for the right keywords, and we have visibility, actually getting clicked on over the competition. And then step number 3 is what we call user engagement. This is really the metrics that the hosting platforms will use to decide whether or not your podcast has high relevancy for a particular keyword. What do I mean? Let's say, for example, people can find your podcast. You have an amazing cover art, incredible show name, and people are just clicking play all the time. Now, let's say, for example, that the majority of people who click play on your episode, they don't get past the first minutes of your show and they bounce and they dip, right? What signal does that send to Apple and Spotify? Is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? If the majority of people are clicking play on this episode that's meant to be about real estate investing for beginners, but no one's actually listening, is that a good thing or a bad thing? And if you think about it from Apple and Spotify's perspective, the main goal of these platforms is to keep users on their platform. So retention time, meaning how long on average a listener consumes your content. If you have an hour-long show and they listen to 30 minutes of it, that means you have a 50% retention time. They aren't consuming the majority of it. So let's say you have another show that's targeting the same keyword, but they have 100% retention time, meaning 100% of people who click play consume the entire content. Which one has higher relevancy for that keyword? It will be the show with the highest retention. And that's step number 3, your user engagement. How are users engaging with your podcast? Are they listening to the majority of it, or are they clicking play and bouncing? If they're clicking play and bouncing, you're not going to rank as high in Apple and Spotify. Now, this is more like on the technical side, you won't rank as high, but also quite literally speaking, if the majority of people aren't listening to your show, they're not going to hear your CTAs. They're not going to build a like, know, and trust. You're not really building an audience. So it's important, regardless of the technicalities, to have a high retention time, meaning making sure when people click playing, they actually listen to the majority of your show. So how do you do that? You optimize your show's intro. You start with a very strong hook that's focused on the actual listener. You let them feel like they're in the right place by repeating the actual title. You mention maybe 3 benefits they're going to gain right at the very start that keeps them wanting to listen to the show. I remember a client of ours, she was stuck for ages with slow growth and she was convinced it was like her exposure strategy. But we did a bit of digging and we found that her retention time, the majority of people were dropping off within the first minute. As soon as we fixed her retention time by adding a strong hook and 3 benefits right at the very start within the first 60 seconds, her show literally tripled, her downloads tripled, her retention time doubled, and in doing so, her listenership tripled in 90 days. So this stuff really is powerful. And again, that's user engagement. Now, another thing that Apple and Spotify will look at would be your reviews, but don't worry too much about that. Like if you just focus more so on like them actually listening through the podcast, you'll get reviews building up anyways. Reviews more so for social proof more than it is anything else. And then finally, we have discoverability, ranking for the right search terms and keywords, so you're actually being found. Visibility, so you're being clicked on over the competition, right? I hope you're following along with me here. And like I mentioned, user engagement, making sure we're sending a positive signal to Apple and Spotify that our show is highly relevant. And we do that by having a very strong intro and actually having content that's good and focused on the keywords we're ranking for. That way, more people listen to the show, it sends a good signal to Apple and Spotify, and your show, well, it climbs up the rankings. And then the final part is building relevancy. This simply means having a focused content strategy that covers the keyword you want to rank for. When you do this, you're giving Apple more and more and more data, letting them know like my podcast is specifically about real estate investing for beginners. Therefore, Apple and Spotify sees the entire body of the work and they know for sure what your show is about. And this is a part that screws a lot of people up because they have a podcast that's unfocused, that's unclear, that's pretty vague, that's interview based, has a variety of different topics, and they don't really have that focused content strategy, which makes it difficult for them to rank on Apple and Spotify. So for our clients, we make sure that we get their actual targeting on point first. We build out a content strategy based on the keywords they want to rank for, and we just consistently publish episodes on a consistent basis that are high value. And guess what, baby? Their podcast starts to grow. So maybe those people in those Facebook groups were right in the first place. Just got to put out the good content consistently and the shows will grow. But of course, you need these strategies and steps in the right place. Look, if you've just discovered this channel, hello, wagwan. That's what they say over here in the UK. There's a bit of slang you're learning here, right? But seriously, welcome. I'm really excited for you to discover this channel. Be sure to go through it, actually binge through it. There's really not that many people sharing solid content, practical strategies and insights on how to properly and effectively grow a show. So if you're a business owner, an expert, an entrepreneur who's trying to build a personal brand with a podcast that actually pays you, gives you an ROI, that actually grows, and you're looking to discover new strategies, welcome, you're in the right place. Look, if you enjoyed this, if you learned something new, be sure to leave a like down below. And of course, leave a comment to let me know your thoughts. With that being said, I'll catch you in the next video. Peace.